why we're here this morning. There are so many questions that really have existed since the beginning of science and technology, when some chimpanzee picked up a rock and started using it for a tool, and science and technology has progressed a lot since then, but it's very clear that science and technology questions have been a part of human existence for quite a long time, and they certainly are now in terms of the balance of short-term, long-term, who is it that's responsible for what, and that's what we're here to address this morning. Who's here? We have people from the federal government here. We have people from universities, from industry, consultants. All of those are not only interested in the answers, but vital to the performance of those answers.
I will content myself with a couple of remarks about your references to the long role of science and technology in society. And of course, the names, what we call it is not important. It's the fact that there has been a constant progress in man's ability to utilize elements of his environment to benefit him. And we disregard this at our peril, I think. The pace of change now is extremely rapid. You do not disseminate today the new knowledge adequately through the society. We have vast discrepancies between cultures, between nations, and within cultures and within nations. And this is at the root of our problem, and that's the theme of what I'm going to really talk to you about. In this case, the fact that we need to educate congressmen as to what's going on in the new age of science and technology, because most of them don't know. Let me acknowledge the leadership role which the IEEE has played for many years on national R&D policy issues. You are not only the world's largest technical professional organization, you have also achieved the highest quality of excellence in a wide variety of services to your member and the most effective level of performance in interacting with the public and with the political leaders of our country at all levels. I could cite a long list of important legislation in which your views have been critical to the progress that we've made in Congress. The fact that all of your goals have not yet been achieved, am I correct in stating that? Is not a reflection of any failure on your part, but rather a reflection of the fact that you have seen further into the future than most of the political leaders whose support is necessary to accomplish your vision. Given the level of energy and the amount of political capital expended, this could have been an opportunity for public and congressional education, rather than an exercise in defending political dogma. For this, both the Democrats and the Republicans are to blame. And I'm going to try and be even-handed here. I have much to criticize in both parties, and that will be clear from my remarks, but I think the biggest flaw in both parties is that they're politicians, and they don't really pay much attention to facts and rationality, and I consider that regrettable. This approach does not preclude tax cuts and reduced regulation where they are justified by the circumstances, but does not rely completely on such policy tools. The differences between these two courses, that is, indirect incentives like tax and regulatory relief, and more direct incentives such as knowledge investments and technology partnerships, has been unnecessarily polarized, with Democrats attacking Republicans as endorsing tax giveaways for the rich, and Republicans attacking Democrats for funding corporate welfare. Neither statement is true, of course, and that is the big problem. As I stated at the outset of my remarks, both of these positions are overly simplistic political positions embraced on each side with stirring rhetoric for presumed partisan gain. You all know that the role of the federal government in technology development is complex, varies by industry, size of company, and other structural characteristics, and changes over time, changes quite rapidly over time, as a matter of fact, just as markets change over time. What we should be looking at is how we can infuse this debate with more facts and how we can develop a better understanding among policymakers of the issues involved. Today, our primary need as a nation is to basically redefine what we mean by security, and one of those new definitions will be to remain competitive with other global players across the spectrum of developing technologies as so vital to global markets. To achieve this, government and industry must work together more effectively than ever before. Without this effective partnership, we would not have been in the past, nor will we in the future be world leaders in fields such as space and satellite capability. We would not have GPS and GIS industry on the verge of multi-billion-dollar global markets. We would not lead the world in commercial aircraft manufacturing, nor would we have the world's preeminent computer industry, global communication networks, software, agricultural industry, health systems, and many other world-class industrial achievements. Likewise, without the federal government, we would not have the skilled human resources that develop these technologies. This is where groups such as IEEE can make a large contribution. Many of your members, most of you in this room, have to struggle with the processes of technology development on a daily basis. You probably have some of the answers to the questions surrounding this issue, or at least could help narrow the scope of the questions. But you also need to use your membership to engage in this broader process of educating legislators and the public. Professional science and engineering societies should be using your local chapters and regional sections to interact with members of the House and Senate, interact with them at home as well as in Washington. These members should be helped to realize that these seemingly arcane debates about technology development have a local face at high technology companies in their state or district, or at colleges and universities at home. They need to gain a better understanding of your world. What I'm trying to do here is to put your work in perspective and urging you not only to broaden it, but to keep in mind that what you're trying to accomplish may be a historical necessity, that is, creating a much broader understanding of the impacts of science and technology on society and how to adapt to those, how to make your efforts in the, using a word that's become popular in the last few years, sustainable, and have them have the fruits of your work clearly recognized as being the benefit that it is to society.
But the general impasse, I think, between Congress and the executive on the issue and the proper role of government in R&D is one that we really need to keep in mind, and that this organization needs to help to resolve. We're talking about strategic research, fundamental research, mission research, applied research, a couple more research things, and I think all of these labels have outlived their usefulness. In fact, they guarantee confusion, but they do not guarantee solutions. The Council, in its report that I mentioned before, tried to start a new way of thinking about it. We divided research into short, medium, and long term, and we try to assign essentially responsibilities for it. Like in the short term, obviously industry is a prime performer, with government a secondary one. In the medium term, it's industry and government, with the university in a supporting role. And from a long-term viewpoint, it's the universities that really need to carry the major responsibility, with government being essentially a supporter. For the first time in science and engineering, we have some competition from abroad, major competition. And I think we have not realized that. This is a very primitive and simple kind of a chart. It shows our U.S. R&D funding on the ordinate and international competition on the horizontal axis. And no doubt about it, we were the acknowledged leader because the international competition was low and our investment in R&D was very high. The question is, where are we going to wind up? I think we are going to wind up somewhere on the right side of that chart because the competition will increase, international competition will increase, and if ours doesn't, then I think we'll be in a losing position. If we increase also, as I hope we will, our investment, at best, we will be in a limited kind of a leadership. And let me say that this is a major change from where we have been over the last 40 and 50 years, and we should keep that in mind. I claim there is no R&D leadership in the country, and you hear that over and over again. You hear it from the people that are in the system, you hear it from the observers of the system, you certainly hear it from Congress. And I don't think there can be a single focal point for leadership. It's not OSTP. It's not the National Science Foundation. It's not the IEEE. It has to be essentially a multi-sectorial coalitions that focuses on that issue. There's no prioritizing going on in R&D. It wasn't necessary in the past, but I claim today it's absolutely necessary. And there needs to be a national strategy. We are not going to be able to do everything the way we thought we were able to do in the past.
I believe that science, basic research, R&D, applications are all essential for a prosperous, growing, and free society. However, and I believe that the government has a role primarily in the area of defense when it is something directly related to defending this country. And that would include everything from early weapons systems to the Strategic Defense Initiative, which I support. I believe that that's a proper role of government, is to make sure that missiles are not dropping on citizens of the United States. But I maintain that science, research and development in the non-defense areas, that is for civil applications, is basically none of the government's business. In the Constitutional Convention, there was actually discussion about whether the federal government should be allowed to directly underwrite scientific endeavors. After all, the founders were interested in these things. Benjamin Franklin was at the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention took a vote on the matter. The matter was defeated. That is, the Constitutional Convention explicitly rejected the notion that the federal government should fund that sort of basic science and research. Look at some of the other projects that were considered absolutely crucial. The supersonic transport, good example. The United States government put, in the 1960s mainly, put a total of $920 million in taxpayers' money into the SST. And back then it was absolutely crucial technology. We absolutely needed to do it. Finally, they pulled the plug in 1973. What was the benefit to the public net? Nothing. We didn't get an SST. The French and the British, of course, continued to put money in it. They now have a nice SST. It loses money. It doesn't even pay. It doesn't pay for its development costs. It lands at very few airports. It's a great big white flying turkey. Maybe a nice-looking flying turkey, but a flying turkey nevertheless. R&D funds often becomes corporate welfare. When it became obvious that moon landings were not going to be the big thing in the future, they came up with the notion of a shuttle, supposedly a reusable vehicle to bring down the costs of space travel. And the notion it would take off like a plane, it would be just as cheap as air flight, and so forth. What in fact you saw happen was that the numbers I have, and they vary, but all of them show that at least for the shuttle compared to, say, Apollo, the cost of putting a pound in space under Project Apollo was about $3,600 to $3,800 per pound. Inflation adjusted, the cost of putting a pound into space with a shuttle is about $6,000 per pound. That's inflation adjusted. Let me conclude this way. There's always a temptation, I find, among scientists, engineers, etc., to apply the model that they use in their own work to government. That is, in an engineer or scientist. I actually originally majored in physics and astronomy and somehow got diverted into what I'm doing today. Will manipulate variables, do experiments, things like this. And there's often a temptation to apply that model to government. You know, well, if we just appoint the right philosopher kings and the right boards, we can determine how resources should properly be allocated. I maintain that that model does not apply to government, that in fact politics is not the best way to distribute resources. The market is.
I thought your talk was pretty interesting. However, in terms of the logic, all of your arguments that you posed for why the government should be funding science probably would apply to the military as well. Yet, for some example, you stated, well, the Constitution specifically somehow indicates that you can fund military research but not non-military research, when in fact it only states that I think something like providing for the general defense. What are your comments on that?
Well, okay, to be exact, it says to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to be used for longer than 2 years, to provide and maintain a navy, let's see, to make rules for the government and regulation of on land and armed forces, and let's see, there's one other thing in here. Yeah, basically it says that they can raise and support an army and a navy. I would maintain that when you say support, what do you mean? Well, 200 years ago, to support would probably mean to go out and, if you need to buy a ship, to make a ship, fine, you do that. If it also meant that you had to, for example, look at better cannons, that was one of the things that you do. We want cannons that are going to knock through the enemy's ship, okay? And so to me, the notion of supporting the military means that we want cannons that are going to penetrate the other guy's ship. If that means that the government has to spend money to develop a new cannon, then fine. Or for that matter, the Strategic Defense Initiative. So I maintain that that kind of research is fine. Now,
as far as the researchers are concerned, as a third stakeholder group, as I said, initially when we were making these transitions, we had to articulate why we needed the change and why we needed to abandon what was a comfortable paradigm and move into an uncomfortable paradigm. A paradigm where people were expected to understand customer needs, to align themselves with customer needs, etc. And quite frankly, most of the researchers grew up in an environment where what they were leveraging was their innate talent in engineering and science. They were born with this talent. They, for one reason or another, either by accident or wisdom, you know, got into engineering, learned how to utilize these talents, and they've spent their whole lives, in effect, up to now, leveraging that innate capability and to create new ideas, etc. And now we're saying to them, we want you to do something different. We want you to understand customers, learn how to position work with customers, learn how to make sales, learn how to deliver value. And people were somewhat reluctant in many cases to make those changes. So we had to articulate why this was necessary, why the world around us was changing, why it was fruitless to simply, you know, yearn for the past, etc. What we found was, my experience was that about 20% of our researchers already knew they had to change, were wondering why management had taken so long to make the changes. There were about 60% of the researchers who really didn't anticipate the need to change, but once it was explained to them, once they had a little bit of time to think about it and get used to the idea, they understood and joined in to make the changes. And there were about 20% of the researchers who never got it, never will get it. And one of the mistakes we made was spending too much time, losing valuable time, trying to bring that last 20% in line. Perhaps the only downside of this change is that there are certain types of more speculative research that need to be funded for reasons I'll get to, and figuring out how to fund that more speculative research. Speculative is not the right word, but I'll explain what I mean a little bit later, is our challenge. So my bottom line on all of this is let's get on with it as engineers. There are certain fora, like Washington, where we have to occasionally articulate the old reasons and the old concepts, because that's all people can understand. And by all means, let's do that. Let's explain again why science and technology is important, etc. But let's not become so trapped by that we forget that we have changes to make, and we have to get on with it as quickly as we can, because time is not on our side. Well, one example of research that's really hard to fund in this shifting paradigm is research that people can make really good arguments will benefit society, but where the time to implementation is going to be 5 to 10 years, maybe a little longer, and where it's unlikely that the incumbent firms in the marketplace will be able to get any proprietary advantage over firms that haven't yet even been formed. So what's the incentive for, even though I fully agree that industry is in the best position, that the competitive marketplace should decide what gets funded and what doesn't. How do you solve this market failure problem of technology which the existing industry participants will agree is important and is going to shape the future and create new opportunities, but where any one firm funding that work can almost bet that it won't be the beneficiary, or certainly won't have any way to appropriate the value of that work?
A major policy change was initiated when Internet was connected to MCI mail. The policy change there was allowing a commercial system to be interconnected to what had been a strictly government operated and owned facility intended for research and development. So that took a very critical decision by the Federal Networking Council in that year to permit. In fact, it was actually in '88 that they decided to permit this. I consider that to be one of the key policy decisions made by the government that transformed the future of the Internet. The policy problems are international in scope, and they have tremendous impact on industry. They can either enable or disable American business or other businesses from conducting making use of the Internet for business purposes. So let me try to summarize a couple of things. First of all, there's no question in my mind that industry will benefit from government research investment. We all know what typically happens. The government invests in a piece of research, somebody gets a very clever idea, gets it out on the net, people try it out, and if it's really interesting and good, it propagates all over the place, at which point industry now has a clue about what it is it should do in the way of developing new products and services. And this relatively modest investment by the government to create a possibility is then followed by enormous amounts of investment by industry to turn it into a product. Any of you who've ever worked in the lab know that if it works in the lab, you've only got 10% down the path towards a product that needs another 90% of investment before it's there. And finally, government policy setting is absolutely critical to business applications on the network.
I understand that there have been some superb discussions from this morning, one of which I'm told was presented by the representative from the CATO Institute, who spoke of the fact that there is no intent from founders and or from the Constitution that relates a justification for federal funding of science. I'm not going to provide an extended opposite point of view on that score, but I respectfully suggest, as a function of at least my study of the founding process, which is rather extensive, that our founding fathers did intend to found a nation for the first time based on commerce, capital, and all of the things that associate with the affordability of a large republic, which they determined was the only class of government that could ultimately protect freedom. And they recognized when they wrote that Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which I believe the gentleman referred to, and which starts with those words that the Congress shall have the power to promote progress in science and the useful arts. that they intended a very fundamental intent, quite aside from the fact that there had to be an instrumentation of the granting of the private rights to one's writings or inventions, that there had to be an obvious agency for the accomplishment of that. But because our founding fathers understood that property, and the most important property is the property of the mind, was so vital that, as the gentleman may or may not have explained, that is the only right granted in the Constitution. Some of us in industry have determined that there is a higher quality management system for the managing of our technology resources and consequences based on the proposition of the use of roadmaps. Our company has used roadmaps now for close to 30 years. They are very sophisticated. They're immensely detailed-oriented. They are engineering in nature, and they give us an ability to think up over the horizon way better than we could, and to engage in those things that are most productive to us. I don't know who the Genesis would be noted to apply to, but some of us, and I think I was among those that was influential, caused that an industry finally embraced technology roadmaps, again engineering roadmaps, when the semiconductor industry decided about 10 and 8 years ago that it could have an industry technology roadmap. And I respectfully suggest that it is a distinguished document. It is serving a gigantic useful purpose. It is stimulating creativity and also application. I derive from that there is a place in this world for science roadmaps. We have learned that competitors can honorably cooperate with each other far more than was ever appreciated in the past. You know what happened at Mitretek, that about 16 of us put that together so that we could improve that part of the food chain of our industry, improve the manufacturers of the tools that are used to make semiconductors. And so 16 of us put our engineers on site in a great big room like this. Some 300 of our peoples have come together from our different companies. And within 2 or 3 weeks, they forget they're from Intel or Texas Instrument or Motorola. They're still very honorable with regard to their loyalty to those institutions. And they discover they can work very comfortably together, very openly together on all pre-competitive, almost science and or very much advanced engineering subjects. No antitrust problems, no conflict of interest problems, and we are doing an absolutely superb job of having resuscitated that part of the food chain of our industry, and are on to some incrementally different objectives, all now private sector funded. All now private sector funded. But there's a principle here. The principle is that competitors, the private sector competitors, and this is certainly even more true among university people or the laboratory people, have an ability, I think they have an inclination, of far greater cooperation among each other than has ever been appreciated in the past. Well, one of those things is that we have to provide to people all over the world sources of energy. They cannot be productive without energy to run their tools. They cannot be liberated if they don't have tools. And all of that is aimed at the proposition that we will then create markets. If we create markets, we certainly do something of great importance to our country, but we must create the ability of the people in those markets to finally have the productivity to earn discretionary income. And that's how you go about increasing the size of the pie.
I'm spending a year on the House Science Committee, and the talk these days is how to fund civilian research. And there are some people who think that industry will pick up the slack as the government puts less money into it. And I'm wondering whether you think that's a reality or whether there is a role for government, particularly in exploratory research.
First off, I think there is a very significant role in government exploratory research, real research seeking to understand the essence of nature. And I think it will have to be, our government, our collective funds is going to have to be the central driving force for the next 5 to 10 years. If we want to motivate and encourage industry to finally get back to the realization it should be putting money into research, meaning companies like ours and all companies that otherwise are progressive, I think we've got to show that the seeding is there based on the fact that Congress shall have the power to promote progress in science and the useful art in order to secure for limited times to authors and inventors their discoveries.
Points to be made here is that the government investment is crucial. It's not always first, by the way. As in the reduced instruction set architectures, the original investment was made by IBM, who then decided it wasn't in their best product interest and stopped, and the government started investing. But all of these led to very large market. I added the one on the bottom, actually, that's not in the NRC report, because that's an area that I personally think is exceedingly important, because microelectrical mechanical systems are a way to make what heretofore have been inanimate objects react to their environment to be helpful to people. Third strategy that you can look to the government to execute, and this one I think is particularly interesting, and that is an investment strategy in science and technology that says provide access to the performers, universities, small business, large business, and to our laboratories across the government.
This is an average R&D growth expenditure between 89 and 93, and as you can see, the United States is well down the curve. This is not a question of good guys and bad guys. This is a question of the pressures on the way companies are valued in our public marketplace, which considers R&D capital in many cases dormant capital. So a corporation is penalized for longer-term R&D investments and rewarded for short-term capital usage. It results in this kind of distribution. I might add that the Japanese are intending to increase by the year 2000, double the percentage of R&D investment. Since this only goes to 93, we might take a look at what the Wall Street Journal reported in 95. The next slide, please, which takes 6 of our major corporations and shows you in dollar terms what their R&D investments have been doing since 1990. If you think I am trying to alarm you out of complacency, I am. This is an example from last August's budget from the House Budget Committee of what the effect of the non-defense R&D budget cuts would be through the year 2000. As you can see, dramatic cuts intended. Next slide, please. Here is a list of the federal R&D partnerships that were funded in 96 in the presidential request, and what it is that the House Budget Committee did. I'm not showing you these for numbers or for decimal places, but for philosophy. What you see there is, I'll tell you, any of you who work hard over the budgets, to go inside of a $1.52 billion budget request spread over 22 R&D agencies and systematically ferret out all but $50 million of it, you really know exactly what you're doing. You do not have an interest or a concern in the character or quality of those technology investments. You are just after cutting out the money if it is a technology investment. This is by way of observation that I'm saying here, because I think that we have the nation's future prosperity at stake.
There should be ways, considering that you are selling progress and money and increased living standards, for the IEEE to do this, to look beyond simply arguing for money, to look beyond fighting over TRP and ATP, and seek to change other things that are, if I'm going to quote this from the National Academy of Sciences report, that the committee, this was the reporting on this was the report from allocating money to science and technology. The committee believes that government policies such as those related to taxation, regulation, intellectual property rights, protection, social mandates and others are usually more important to commercial outcomes than is direct government funding to industry.
The saving rate today in this country is down to 4.5%. That means Americans are consuming 95% of their disposable income. That's half of what it was back in the 60s and the 70s when we were saving about 10% of disposable income. Now, I don't like making international comparisons, but to just put that into context, the East Asians are saving 20 to 30% of their income. We have historically been low savers, and I don't think the United States is going to get back. We're going to be able to get to the 20 and 30 range. But I don't understand why we've gone from 10 to 5 and continuing to fall. Again, Americans are consuming 95% of disposable income. We are making less income today, but boy, we're enjoying it a lot more because we're buying a lot more. And personal debt is at all-time highs. Personal bankruptcies are at all-time highs. Okay? So this is actually the ladder, if you will. If you want to have productivity, you want to have growth, you have to have investment. In order to have investment, you have to have capital, and saving is the place for that to acquire that capital. Our group and others called for, recommended, this is over the last couple of years, that declines in defense R&D should be met by increases in civilian R&D, so at least there was a balance. This was a beginning place in terms of restoring our investment in R&D. And what I find in the 96 budget was, in fact, the opposite took place. Defense R&D rose by 1%, and civilian R&D declined by a little bit over 1%. So I would argue that we're actually moving in the wrong direction in terms of where we and others, many in this room, were arguing over the last couple of years. Well, we would argue very strongly that public investment has a direct link to private investment. Public investment sends a strong message that this is where we want to see capital coming to. And this is my point in terms of composition matters. It matters how we define our priorities in our budget, and also matters how we allocate capital in our economy. In fact, if you look at most of the studies that have been done currently on the distribution of income, the one thing that keeps coming out is that those people, basically giving you a conclusion, those people in whom we invest, i.e. through education, they have had higher returns than those people in whom we don't invest. So two things. We need to invest more in those people we invest in, but we also have to invest in more people. Our society really does not understand the real role that technology plays, not just in their daily lives of getting on their computer and the internet, but in creation of jobs and income. And we must make that message clear, because if we don't, no one else will.
The telecommunications bill that was just passed was probably a product of people starting to think that there is a new way of doing business, how we educate, how we deliver medical services, excuse me, how we communicate with each other, how we will do business around the world. You can always tell, I'll get a little political here, you can always tell when a group of kids, especially seniors in high school that come to Washington to visit, or you go to their school and visit, you can always tell who they talk to last. If you'll listen to kids, now I always say, well, how you develop a sort of an instinct on what your people in your state is thinking, how do you do that? Visit a fourth or a fifth grade school. That's all you have to do. And listen to the kind of questions the kids ask you. 9 times out of 10, that's what Mom and Dad was discussing at the breakfast table that morning. We will see NASA play a larger role in each one of our neighborhoods, because NASA will be the engine or the item that will trigger the imagination of young people. Space, it grabs the imagination, and that will get kids involved in our sciences, in our mathematics, our physics. And with that, you don't have, then government should just get out of the way and let those young people dream a little bit, but then kind of help them along the way. and to make sure that they'll be a part of the process. So really, it is nothing more, the government is nothing more than being an advocate for your industry, to make sure that we don't pass laws that hamper you from not doing things. And of course, and we can do that awfully easy too. So I would hope that that we would shoulder our part of the obligation of being an advocate for the science and technology community, to make sure that you have an environment in which we can build, an environment that offers opportunities for our young people. Because let's face it, I'm 61 years old. For all practical purposes, I'm over the hill and in the grave. It is the next generation that we have to take care of now, because what we do today, we will not see those ideas bear fruits until after we're gone.
Do you think the debate in Congress will remain as polarized as it has been over the level of support for technology partnerships and whether, in fact, there should even be these sorts of programs like ATP or the Technology Reinvestment Project, that sort of thing?
Well, you're tuned in because the debate is ongoing right now. We have, in fact, I will tell you, the chairman on the House side, he and I disagree on a couple of things, but I will tell you, when push comes to shove, I think we will find a way in order to accommodate each other's wishes. You know, politics is still the art of compromise, and maybe sometimes you can get them to compromise more than you do. And so we'll always have the debate on how much government should be participating in and footing the bill.